friends. My name is David Hope-Jones. I'm the Chief Executive of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership, and welcome to this, our fifth meeting in our series of 8 on governance in Malawi. We've got 2 fantastic speakers today and a brilliant chair. I don't want to take up any more of the airtime than is necessary to say the Scotland-Malawi Partnership is delighted to sponsor this series and the forthcoming book, which it looks to serialize. I'll say another few brief words at the end of our 60 minutes, just as far as what our next session is. But without any further ado, delighted to hand over to Reverend Professor Kenneth Ross. Ken, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and good afternoon to everyone. And let me add my welcome to David's, and also particular welcome to anyone who's joining the webinar for the first time today. And perhaps especially for your sake, let me briefly introduce the book on which the webinar series is based. It's titled Beyond Impunity, New Directions for Governance in Malawi. And its inspiration comes from the remarkable events of 2019 to 20, when Malawi won global acclaim for the peaceful and constitutional way in which it nullified a flawed presidential election and held a fresh one, which brought a new government into office. The book celebrates the strength of Malawi's democracy, as demonstrated by this achievement, but let me hasten to add, it is neither triumphalistic nor complacent in tone. Instead, it views the political drama of 2019 to 20 as an opportunity to come to terms with some of the enduring problems that bedeviled Malawi's public life since the start of the democratic era. It is therefore a critical analysis, but one that we believe is constructive and has much to offer to the strengthening of governance in Malawi and perhaps elsewhere. Now, let me anticipate the first question that's going to come in our discussion. When is the book going to be available? We are pleased that the Oxford printing of the book is already available through the good offices of the African Books Collective, but I know that many of us are waiting impatiently for the Malawi edition. The book, let me assure you, is at the printers, but there has been a setback with Cyclone Anna and the subsequent power cuts that have delayed progress. But I'm very much hoping we'll have more positive news by the time we're gathering for the next webinar. Now, turning to today's webinar, the topic might raise some eyebrows: legal responses to electoral violence and democratic governance in Malawi, the case of the 2019 and 2020 elections. Malawi has a well-earned reputation for being a peaceful country, and indeed it is very peaceful most of the time in most places. Malawi's politics, however, has had an undercurrent of violence that has been persistent through successive regimes, going all the way back to the time the British were in charge. This undercurrent occasionally comes to the surface, and one of the times when this can happen is when it's close to an election. This is a very sensitive subject into which angels might fear to tread. However, with us this afternoon, there is an angel by the name of Kanyongolo, who is not afraid to step into this topic. What can I say about EDGE? Usually when you're introducing an academic, you mention the position they hold and maybe 1 or 2 important books or articles that they've published. But if we did this with EDGE, we would barely have scratched the surface of his contribution. Of course, he has had a distinguished academic career at Chancellor College, and particularly in the Faculty of Law. But what has been distinctive about Edge is that he has made his critical acumen available to the public life of the nation, combining his legal skills with an astute reading of the politics of the day to bring an impartial but incisive voice to the discussion of Malawi's national life during several decades. He has also been unusual in his commitment to fostering cross-disciplinary and multidisciplinary discussions at a time when many scholars have become entirely wrapped up in their own specialism. Hence, Edge was the go-to person when the project that led to this book was being hatched. So the book would have been incomplete without a contribution from the man himself. So we are delighted that this afternoon we can welcome Professor Edge Kanyongolo to make the presentation in today's webinar. Over to you, Edge.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks to everyone who has found time to attend this. I have about 15 minutes at most, so I will try to go straight to the point. My contribution to this book is this chapter, which looks at legal responses to electoral violence, with specific focus on the 2019-2020 elections. And broadly, what this chapter tries to do is to examine, although it doesn't do that in much detail, but to examine, let's call it the anatomy of election-related violence in Malawi. What are we dealing with? What does this beast look like? What characteristics does it have, demographic, etc., and how does that help us understand it in depth? So it's to understand the anatomy, but then again to also understand its impact on democratic governance. But that would be too broad a task, and therefore to narrow it down to legal responses helps us to examine both the violence and how it is responded to in the interest of democratic governance. So, as I said, I will try to be as concise as possible. So I am going to make basically 4 main points. One is one that will be perhaps of interest mainly to academics, but perhaps even others as well. And it is a definitional issue, and I will not dwell on it, except to highlight it, to simply say that while it is easy to use the term election-related violence or election violence, when you get down to it, it may require a little more precision. Now, in the paper, I tried to look at 1 or 2 authors who have tried to examine this, because let's take 2 examples, 2 extreme examples to illustrate the point. One is an obvious one. You would call this election-related violence. I think it's reported in the paper as well, where people attack officials of Malawi Electoral Commission in the course of their administering of an election. They run away with the electoral materials. I think that's clearly election-related violence. But what about if 2 people are having an argument in a pub over elections, and that results in violence? Is that, in a literal sense, it's related to elections, but is that what we are talking about? So I think the first point is to clarify terms, and I refer to one definition in the paper which says we are really focusing on the type of violence which is purposely intended to influence the processes and outcomes of elections. So the intention to influence, I think, is critical. But then again, we can debate that, just like any other academic conceptual discussions, this could go on. But that was the first point, to be clear in terms of the terms we're using. What is election-related violence? The second point I wanted to make was to explain why I think election-related violence or electoral violence is connected to democratic governance. In some ways, is this just throwing in democratic governance because the book has democratic governance and therefore you kind of put that tagline to make it relevant? The answer is no. I think electoral violence or election-related violence has an instrumental link to democratic governance in at least three senses. A direct effect that election-related violence has on governance. Then number one, it impedes, and it's an obvious point, it impedes or constrains participation. People get deterred from participating. If elections and the election activities get the reputation that violence is highly likely, then people will withdraw either from the political rallies and even from voting itself. The lower ring of participation is an obviously impacts democratic governance. Secondly, is again another obvious point, the violation of human rights that occurs. Human rights are an integral part of democratic governance, and the violations of rights, I think if you look at the chapter, I'll come to this in a minute, you do see a list of fairly serious violent incidents where human rights were violated, including the right to life. I think there are a number of cases where people lost lives, but property, dignity, gender equality, etc., all these become victims of election violence in the particular context in which they occur. The third point is the resources point. The more resources you have to invest in dealing with election violence, and it is quite substantial resources. If you look at the involvement of the Malawi Defense Forces, again, a point I'll mention in a minute. So you are diverting a lot of resources to deal with election related. You investing a lot in public order and law enforcement. I mean, here I may mention as a footnote, I do believe that the Scottish government, Malawi government partnership has quite a substantial part on public order enforcement. And I'm not too sure how much is invested in that, just specifically to deal with elections. In a country that doesn't suffer from an excess of resources, every penny counts. And therefore, election-related violence is almost an unproductive drain on public resources. The third point I wanted to make is now to deal with the legal responses themselves. And again, here I start with a definitional point, because somebody did point out this on an earlier version of the paper, which was that legal responses as used in this chapter is probably perhaps a little more extensive than would normally be the case. I mention this because I include, for example, action or inaction by Parliament. I take that with part of a legal response. Now, there was division of opinion, as I said. Others said, no. I mean, legislation is not really a legal response. But I insist that if we take the totality of legal responses as being the organized action by institutions that are involved in the making of law, enforcement of law, adjudication of law, then I think we do have to include all the actions, Parliament, the police, cabinet, the courts, all these that are involved in generating, producing, and reproducing the law that can deal with election violence, I think are included. So that's the sense in which I use legal responses. Very quickly then. Perhaps the significance of the responses can only be appreciated with a very quick run of what is it they are responding to? What is it in the particular context they were responding to? Now, Ken mentioned at the beginning that Malawi is a peaceful country, and we were lauded for the manner in which this election was handled, including the peaceful conclusion. But I think this should not make us lose sight of the fact that there were significant levels of violence during this election. Very quickly, just to give you a sense of this and how serious, well, compared to other countries, I agree, I admit. I mean, I did go to Kenya as part of a fact-finding investigation of post-election violence. So I do know the scale of election violence that we talk about when we talk about countries such as Kenya and others. So this might pale in comparison. But one life lost is a life. Violence occurs is violence. So I think it's important to just get a bird's eye view of the nature of the violence, the scale of the violence, and then talk about perhaps the responses to it. So I'll just quickly go through this so that you get a sense. In Lilongwe, 4 people killed in an arson attack. They were burnt in their own house, including 2 children. 1 police officer was killed by a group of rioters. I will not give you the political dimensions, but take it from me, this was election related. So 1 police officer stoned to death. Over a dozen women and girls assaulted and raped, allegedly by police officers. Women and girls, dozens, I think, or a dozen, assaulted and raped in their own homes, by the way, I should mention. Several police officers severely injured after being attacked by a group of stone throwers. People burning a government complex and the offices of the Japanese International Cooperation Agency. Burning down a number of government buildings, offices, a building belonging to the ruling party and the police unit. Assaults on various actors in Blantyre, opposition supporters. In Mangochi, a woman is attacked, beaten up, and dressed in public. In Karonga, a driver of a ruling party vehicle, victim of a violent attack that left him unconscious. A journalist in Doha, a journalist of the Malawi Broadcasting Corporation, the state broadcaster, attacked a senior official, attacked and so on. So you have more than a dozen fairly serious incidents, and therefore, overall, it was a peaceful transition, but I think that should not make lose sight of the fact that lives were lost, people were injured, and there were a number of other things that occurred. So back to legal responses, which was my third point. If we just quickly go through the lawmakers, the legislature did not, during this period or immediately before that, pass any law to respond to the prospect of election violence or its occurrence, to react to it. So they didn't. What would I have expected them to do? There is a gap in the law, I pointed out in the paper, which I think they could have filled, which is to recognize election-related violence as a sui generis offense, an offense that is more serious, an aggravated offense, to use the fact that something was done in an election context as an aggravating fact. So in effect, the legislature can create a sui generis offense to capture the seriousness of election violence. Very quickly, the executive itself, how did it respond? Well, there was law enforcement, there was the police, but the people's trust in the police had been lost. So eventually it involved the Malawi Defense Forces, the military was on the streets. I think that's a worrying development. I'm sure that people will discuss that. But that was the part of that response by the executive. The judiciary's response is fairly limited because by nature they are reactive. They wait for people to bring things to them. So if prosecutors and law enforcement officers are biased, which is one point that is made here in law enforcement, then they want to bring to the court cases, for example, in the majority of cases, against opposition people. So you really can't blame the courts for only adjudicating opposition cases, as it were, in that sense. However, I think there is a little more they could do in terms of deterrence, and they could use their discretion in sentencing, etc., in these cases to make it, if something is related to elections, it should be treated as an aggravated offense. Why? There is more than just the victim before you. As I said earlier, what you're doing has a broader impact on democracy, etc. And it's in that sense that I'm saying, I think that the legislature, the executive, the judiciary could have been a little more proactive in how they responded to the situation that we had at hand. So my conclusion is basically the responses were inadequate. The legislature could have done more. The executive could have done more. And perhaps I should just say a little more. The major problem with the executive, at least as perceived, but perhaps even with evidence, is the bias, the selective enforcement of the law, which is a broad problem. I think was a major issue in that context. The use of the military, I think, is something that's worth highlighting. because it's becoming a little more normalized in discourse as well. I think we need to worry. I think law enforcement should remain a police function. And the issue of the creative use of judicial discretion is perhaps a little more complex, because the judges will always claim judicial independence and they shouldn't really be told how to do their job. But I think it's also something that is worth doing. Judges who are conscious of these offenses, because the judges do they adjudicate on these sorts of offenses all the time: assault, arson, murder, etc. But the point I'm making is that I think that when this is election related, the courts should approach it differently. The legislature should approach it differently. So ultimately, I think that those are some of the key talking points. But I think at the center of this, one of the most serious of all these things I've mentioned is selective enforcement of the law by the executive. Because the result of selective enforcement, and I don't know whether Gerhard will agree or not, but selective law enforcement undermines deterrence. And if deterrence is undermined, then what we are saying is people will continue perpetrating election-related violence. And if they do, this is bad news for democratic governance, as I pointed at the link before. Finally, one point which again is also significant, and I did re-highlight it, but I was hoping it would arise, is that as long as the only people who are punished for these offenses are the perpetrators on the street, the young men and women who are sent to do these things, and we don't get the kingpins and the planners, because on many occasions this is organized. So liability must go not only to the young men and women you arrest throwing stones, but perhaps a stronger effort should be made to find out who is organizing this and going after them. But obviously, that takes us back to the issue of selective enforcement. Therefore, I think that election violence has the potential to undermine whatever gains democratic governance gains Malawi has made. But we cannot really, even this conversation, I think will be enriched, and in future, I hope we'll return to a conversation like this, but with more research. So as frustrating as this may sound, one of the points that I want to end on is that we don't know enough. We don't understand enough about the anatomy of election violence, and there is need for more in-depth research, especially empirical research, to find out what is really happening. Why is there more violence in that area than in that area? Why is it that perhaps among the people who are perpetrating, you have, what is the age group in there? Why certain places seem to be immune from violence and others perhaps prone to violence? I think these are questions which could not be answered in this chapter, but I think that are extremely important to be answered. Otherwise, these conversations will can be no more than speculative. So part of it is more research to understand this. But I think we have enough now to begin to identify the critical points, as it were: selective law enforcement, lack of legislative proactive intervention in this, lack of judicial creativity, and the treating of all these as simply generic assaults and so on. So, well, I would be amiss if I didn't thank everybody, for particularly Ken and Asiat and others, and Mulafu, for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this chapter, but also the opportunity to speak to the chapter at this webinar. Thank you very much.
Not at all, Edge. It's very much our thanks to you. It's been a characteristic combination of analytical clarity and a passionate concern for justice, and especially for the vulnerable. And I don't think we're left in any doubt after this that there are serious issues to be confronted. Before we go to the next stage in our program, could I invite everyone, if you'd like, to make use of the chat function in the Zoom meeting. Maybe you just want to give a friendly hello to everyone. But also, if you have a question, if Edge's presentation has prompted a question in your mind and you can write it in the chat, we'll try and make sure that we include it in the Q&A that will be coming up very soon. But before we come to that, those who have been at the webinars before will know that the pattern is that this kind of analysis of the Malawian context is followed by a Scottish respondent. Today we're delighted to have with us Dr. Gerhard Anders, who's Senior Lecturer in African Studies and International Development at the University of Edinburgh's Centre for African Studies. Dr. Anders' research focuses on globally circulating ideas about development, good governance, international criminal justice, and the rule of law, tracking the everyday experiences of government officials, lawyers, and others involved in the production and diffusion of administrative and legal knowledge. Gerhard is not a stranger in this space, having collaborated for many years with EDGE, and also being a good friend and advisor to the Scotland-Malawi Partnership. Like EDGE, he combines legal expertise with a broad concern for the common good and is very well placed to respond to today's presentation. So Gerhard, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ken, for these really kind words of introduction. I am honored to serve as respondent from Scotland, even though clearly my roots are not here on these islands. Really, EDGE is an exemplary public intellectual and such an incisive academic. So every time it's just a pleasure to engage with him, whether it is over a cup of coffee at the Gymkhana Club in Zomba or here in the virtual space of the Malawi-Scotland webinar series. And he mentored me actually when I was a young PhD student more than 20 years ago at the University of Malawi. And indeed, as Ken has mentioned, we have worked together on several projects that have been funded by the British government, where we took deep dives into high-level corruption and the Cashgate scandal, chasing officials on Capitol Hill, trying to get a sense of the Cashgate mess and doing research. So I should maybe just give a word of a caveat maybe. I'll deviate a bit from the format that you're used to, in the sense that my response will not draw directly on Scottish or British experiences. So I'll refrain from drawing a direct comparison, but obviously there's always a comparison in anything that we discuss. So to the chapters, I really enjoyed the EDGE's talk and his presentation, and I also enjoyed reading the chapter that it drew on. So I can only reiterate the point that you should look out for this edited volume, and as soon as it is available, please do order a copy. It's a fantastic selection and a great chapter by EDGE in there. And I think the focus on formal institutions in EDGE's chapter and in the book is really welcome and timely, and it fits in a wider move away from blaming neo-patrimonialism for everything that goes wrong. So I think there's a certain shift in the study of politics in Africa, away from an emphasis on informality and patron-client relationships, even though those are, of course, important, to the role of formal institutions, whether it's Malawi Electoral Commission, police, law enforcement agencies, and so on. So I think that's where this book and this chapter really speak to this debate. And the issue of electoral violence, and Ken has alluded to this, in Malawi does deserve more attention. And that's why what EDGE's chapter here in this collection is so welcome. It really constitutes an important contribution to the study of violence during the election cycle in Malawi. which is often kind of overlooked. Malawi is celebrated as a peaceful country, but there is this undercurrent that Ken also refer to, which emerged during the colonial era and also the late colonial era and the early independence era. Election violence was an issue in the first elections in the independent Malawi. So that's really important, and I think it supplements very nicely studies by Chinga Ipe that covers the time up to 2014, and Anika Becker's a comparative study of Kenya and Malawi, and again a lot of attention to Kenya, and I think it is really important to have more attention to the situation in Malawi. And another thing that I think is really refreshing about this, it doesn't overemphasize the importance of ethnicity. Ethnicity, yes, it does play a role, but it's really not the driving factor in election violence, more specifically, but even in elections. I mean, there's a regional theme, and of course it has ethnic undertones, but I think the situation is much more complicated and nuanced than is often allowed for in a sort of simple ethnicity reading of these situations. So that's another really strength, not only of the chapter, but of the book. So I think Edge's contribution, I'm picking up on a point that he, on one of his later or last points, Edge's contribution and the edited collection is a contribution to a wider debate about consolidation of democracy in Malawi and in Africa more broadly. And I think he really fleshes out very nicely that the election violence is, of course, a danger to democratic consolidation and to the advances of democracy, but that Malawi has really come a long and impressive way that has then culminated basically in the 2019 and in the 2020 rerun, which was unprecedented. So that's really something I think that shows the maturity or the maturing of democracy in Malawi and the strength of democracy, of civil society in Malawi as well. So I think that's really welcome. And there's one point that I would want to raise as a question maybe to Edge. Now, some of the studies of election violence in Malawi have observed a decline of election-related violence over the years. So basically saying that it has actually decreased from the 1994, 1999, and then towards 2004 and 14. And it would be interesting to see you or to hear your view on this. Do you think now that this trend is being reversed through the violence connected to the or associated with the 2019 election, or is it part of that wider trend that would indicate again a strengthening of democracy in Malawi? So the basic point here would be the less violence, the more mature democracy, right? So is there a trend still? Is there violence? Yes, but is the violence actually decreasing when we look at it in a sort of 30-year frame since the 1990s? All right. Well, I don't want to go too long, so I just wanted to highlight really a few points and a few issues that might be worth exploring in the Q&A and in the discussion. Let me just wrap up with a few maybe more specific questions to Edge, but they could be also raised or could, like, I don't know, inform the discussion. So I'll just put these out. So the first one would be, is there actually a decrease of election-related violence? And does the 2019 violence fit into that pattern? So that's I think number one that I would be really interested now that I have the opportunity to engage with Edge and the others here. And the other one is, should we differentiate more between different types of perpetrators and victims? So if we say there are voters that could be involved in election violence as perpetrators, there are political parties, usually through their youth wings, that are perpetrators of violence in elections. And then there is the government, Edge alluded to that, the police usually. Do we have to differentiate between these both as victims and perpetrators. There was a police officer that was burned. So here the government would be the victim. And the perpetrators, I think he wasn't quite going there to say who the perpetrators were, but do we need to differentiate that? And do we need to differentiate between pre and post-election violence? Is there a difference between election violence in the run-up, basically intimidating others or in the heat of the battle of campaigning, and the one after an election, basically disputing the legitimacy of the vote? That's the thing that happened in the 2019, right? So is there a difference that we have to make? So really it's open for discussion. So it's not only to Edge, but I thought these were points that are really, or questions that really arise from his chapter that might be worthwhile to address. And then finally, in terms of the legal response, because I think the law is such a magnifying glass for social conflict and political conflict. I think that's what Edge is doing so well. We use the law basically as a magnifying glass to understand conflicts in society and political conflicts. Now, if we think about legal responses broadly speaking, as he does, should we look beyond criminal law? Because I agree with him, because the studies that we did on high-level law enforcement or high-level corruption and law enforcement basically kind of centered on this idea of selective justice, something that Edge has been alluding to. And the question is, with a criminal justice system as overwhelmed as it is, would there be a role for non-criminal responses through the electoral law? Maybe could the Malawi Electoral Commission play a role there, not in terms of criminal offenses, but other offenses? So that's really an open question. Should we go beyond the criminal law in terms of the legal responses, and how could that look like? How could an interface or cooperation between Malawi Electoral Commission and the police look like in terms of a close cooperation with an early warning system, maybe in terms of violence? And I think the current head of the Malawi Electoral Commission would be really well placed to do something like that. So I was just wondering whether there are any views on that. And I think at that, I'll draw to a close and give the floor to the questions and answers. And maybe if Edge wants to kick off and responding like a first response, I'm looking to Ken. Is that all right? Maybe if
yeah,
Edge
no, thanks so much,
all right.
Gerhard, and a fantastic series of questions. And in fact, simultaneously with your speech, the chat has been very active.
That's good. I didn't see that.
I can see some echoes between your questions and some that we have in the chat. But one thing that was quite distinctive, I haven't seen it anywhere else from yourself, Gerhard, and I think I might put this to Edge. First of all, is the question of trend. Is electoral violence increasing? Is it decreasing? Or if we reviewed the period, say from 1994, is it pretty much a constant? Have you got any sense on this, Edge?
Well, not really. I mean, I always hesitate when I don't have empirical evidence with me. So fine. I mean, I'm prepared to, for the sake of argument, accept that it is declining. But my point would be that even if it is, unless one deals with the structural issues, unless one understands it a little more, I mean, this is a trend that could, even if it's declining, it could come back again. And that's why I said earlier, we need to understand the anatomy. We need to understand what is it about, let's call it the context, for example. What is it about the context that makes violence rise or fall? Because if it's been falling, and we have a good sense of what is making it fall, then we can, in a sense, engineer it to ensure that it remains down there. But unless we understand, maybe there are certain conditions which may arise in future that can bring it right up again. So in a sense, although I don't have the evidence about the trends and I don't have the good sense of it, I'm prepared to accept it's falling, but that still requires, we can't assume that that will be permanent. So that would be my provisional answer now.
Good. No, thank you, Edge. And let me turn to the chat. And there's a wonderful series of questions already. But let me also encourage people to,
I have noted them.
If there's thoughts in your mind. If time escapes and we haven't addressed all of them, there's also going to be an opportunity. We'll ask Dr. Kanyongolo and Dr. Anders to respond in writing afterwards. So don't feel that you have to hold back if you have a question and you think there's too many. But let me pick up one, which I think was also echoed in Gerhard's talk. In fact, a couple of questions that are quite close together. So to both of you, where do you place the anti-government and anti-MEC demonstrations organized by the human rights organizations in Malawi in 2019 and 2020? Was that also election-related violence? Were they politically motivated? Maybe a question that's close to it is, given the way elections are conducted in Africa in general, with high probability of rigging, do you think that violence shapes the elections towards the voice of the majority?
I'll have a go at it. I think that was Mr. Banda about that one. Whether the anti-MEC demonstrations were election-related, I think that's the easiest question, in the sense that the answer is simply yes, they were. In fact, a lot of examples I was giving about people burning down things and so on were actually allegedly by supporters of these human rights organizations in the course of, or at least on the sidelines of the demonstration. So that definitely I would call election-related violence. So I think the quick answer to that would be yes, those demonstrations can be said to fall within that category.
Did you want to come in, Gerhard, on this?
Yeah, sure, I could add to that. I mean, it speaks to the point that I raised about should we differentiate between the pre-election violence, basically during campaigning, which usually happens, candidate X is going to Mangochi and his car is stoned there, and candidate Y is going to Jolo and the car is stoned there. During campaigning, and the post-election violence really is about the legitimacy of the vote. So a large number of people take to the streets because they think the vote was rigged, right? So there was another question about vote rigging. And I would imagine, but I stand to be corrected there by Edge, I mean, that these demonstrations, including the non-violent forms of demonstrating, even if it maybe was illegal, played a role in basically just keeping that contestation, the challenge to the vote of 2019 alive. And then, of course, it is the judges that then show their independence and their activism. And speaking to the point about the rigging, maybe, I mean, that's maybe why the Constitutional Court's activism is justified. Because the Constitutional Court was very active. And again, I stand to be corrected by the constitutional law expert because I'm coming at this from a criminal law expertise. But the Constitutional Court deviated in two important respects from precedent. Number one, the threshold for challenging or for declaring an election as nullified, to nullify an election, the threshold was actually lowered by the Constitutional Court. Before the threshold was, did it make a difference? And in a way that put the burden, the evidence on the petitioner, because they would have to show that it had made a difference. And that the courts had maintained until then, and then the court deviated from that. It was upheld by the Supreme Court of Appeals that actually irregularities, even if they did not have a demonstrable effect on the outcome, still qualify and still can be the foundation for nullification. Number two is the 50+1 rule, which was actually a direct deviation again from a former Supreme Court ruling, which said the plurality of votes. And now the courts basically, did a creative, active thing and said, no, it's 50+1. And that's maybe justified because of the danger of the rigging that was mentioned there.
No, thank you both. Turning back to
I don't know, Ken,
yes, please come back in again.
yeah, I wanted, I'm looking at the time and realize we are running out of time. So I thought I should just quickly run through some of my brief responses to the questions in the chat box as well, because I was taking notes.
Yes,
of all of them.
please do.
So very quickly, Alan asked whether this also has to do with, and I love the question, Alan, whether underneath this isn't really the issue of unemployed youth and bored youth. And I would say that's probably a very significant part of the story. And that's why I keep going back to this ad nauseum almost, that we need to understand this a little more. And in the paper itself, I make this point that it seems, in fact, if we look, and I can connect it to Gerhard's question about should we be understanding a little more who is the perpetrator, who is the victim. Absolutely, Gerhard, we need to do that. That's part of the analytical task. And I think initially, without any in-depth analysis, clearly the vast majority of people who are perpetrating this violence, I'm prepared to bet, were male and youth and young. And most of the serious violence happened in urban location or semi-urban. So basically, which also coincides with areas of higher unemployment. So Alan, my tentative answer is yes, I think that this is part of the story. Unemployment, poor living conditions, idle youth hanging around waiting for a job, and therefore you can join a mob. The question of anti-make demonstrations and whether we can call them election violence, I think we answered it. Let me connect it again to also what Gerhard asked. Should we distinguish pre, during, and post? And the answer is simply yes, but there is a huge academic debate around that. I think that I don't do justice in the paper in reviewing the literature, but there is quite a substantial debate around the merits and demerits of segmenting, because different variables play at different points and they have different effects. Others say, no, we can't. If we, on the one hand, claim that elections are a continuing process that is really has no beginning and end, it just, then we can't begin to segment that. It's a whole area of debate. I want to take two questions together. Stella and David as well asked. David asked, how do we deal with selective law enforcement? And I want to connect it to Stella's point, but also I think is it Kama's point. Can we really hope that we get to a point where institutions that are being selective and biased drop their biases and act, you know, above their own, forego their own interests in order to pursue the public good? Are we still that naive, as it were? I don't think we should expect them. We should expect them to act to advance their interests. However, what we can do is to enhance accountability. In other words, let's assume that they will act selfishly. And therefore, let's not put hope in them, in their own self-enlightenment. Let's almost assume the worst of them. And therefore, because we do, then we need to strengthen the accountability mechanism. And I'll give you two examples of how we can do that. With regard to the police, the law already provides for the creation of an independent police complaints authority, just like one has in other places. Now, if you had, in theory, it's there. And if the public really knew and made full use of it and organized and thousands of complaints were going, etc., it might make a difference. And then you connect this to Parliament, because ultimately it's the money. So if Parliament and committees can also jump into the fray and use their control of budgetary approval, etc., that's one way. So the main point is to deal with selective law enforcement. And if I can connect it to Stella as well, corruption, perhaps even in the judiciary, etc., more accountability, more transparency. Use existing institutions like the Independent Police Complaints Authority. Let's re-energize them, make them work. In the case of the judiciary, last week they announced the formation of some kind of complaints commission for the judiciary, for people to go and complain. I can almost bet 95% of us didn't even pay attention to it. Yet we are on that side very concerned about judicial corruption. So effectively, short answer, more accountability, more transparency, and the use of political institutions to put pressure on these institutions because they will not become good out of their own goodwill. I think basically that, Janet asked another interesting question very quickly about and it's a good question, because she's saying, I am saying the police, people lost trust in the police, and therefore the military came and did law enforcement, and people kind of happy with it. And I'm saying, no, wait a minute, I think the military shouldn't be. But then she says, but what do we do? If you send the military back, and yet there is no trust in the police, where does that leave us? I think that's why the power in Janet's question. I think the answer is, in my view, the same one. There has to be serious police reform, and not just internal reform, but we must also, as citizens, reclaim our power to hold the police accountable. The law has already given us the tools, we don't use them. There is the Independent Police Complaints Authority. Hardly anybody talks about it. That's a route for us, you and I, to go and make demands on the police. Even under the Police Act, citizens around every police station, in fact, can form committees. I think it's called community police committees or something. We can supervise each police station in this country. So the mechanisms are there. I think we need to move on. I hope I've covered the wide range of questions that I captured in the chat room, but I thought I should just take them together, not to miss, because I clearly we are running out of time. We needed 24 hours for this.
No, that's very true, Edge, but you've done a wonderful sprint through a number of profound questions. But I think as time is racing away from us, I should come back to Gerhard just for any final reflections on what you've seen in the questions or what you've just heard from Edge.
No, I mean, really, I think I switched on my camera when Edge said we need more research, because that clearly we need more evidence and to basically have an informed discussion. Is there decrees? Who are the perpetrators? Who are the victims? How do we classify election-related violence? All of that. And I mean, I just want to say that this is we make the best out of an online thing, because it brings people together from so many different places, and it's been such a wonderful and stimulating conversation. I think as a final thing, I think the point that I wrote in the chat was that probably if you institutionalize the cooperation between Malawi Electoral Commission, which of course should truly be independent, and the Malawi Police Service, that could maybe play a role in that, addressing some of these issues that Edge was referring to, in addition to the complaints procedures. So I guess there's a lot to be said for creating these more resilient and stronger formal institutions that cut across the sort of pillars between police and electoral bodies and electoral laws. So I think I want to leave it at that and give the word back to Ken, I suppose, and David to wrap it up, I imagine.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Gerhard. And I think we all feel very privileged to have sat in on this very lively interchange between the two of you. And it's the kind of conversation I could imagine someday continuing in the Gymkhana Club in Zomba over the cup of coffee. Or even there's another liquid refreshment available there that I could imagine, depending on the time of day, might accompany the discussion. So for those of us who've been able to just listen and reflect on your discussion, we are really thankful. And there was no response I heard that was saying, this is not a serious issue, or, we think this is an acceptable level of violence that's taking place, and we just have to live with it. I think there's been a consensus around the whole discussion here that this is a very serious issue that Malawi needs to confront. So our discussion really has been focused on agency, the question of who is going to grasp this nettle. And I think we've been exposing the weaknesses of some of the agencies and institutions that ought to be able to provide a solution. But I think that gives us a clear direction, a way forward for this discussion, which will continue to be very important. So it's one of the things with a Zoom meeting, even if you do thumbs up gestures and things, it's never quite the same as the thunderous round of applause that we would have if we're all in the same room. But I know the spirit of the meeting is that big hand, both for Edge and Gerhard, and such a rich discussion and an important discussion. Looking ahead, this has been number 5 in an 8-part webinar series, and it's going to change format a little bit in the next one because of the nature of what happened in 2019 to 20. There is a certain priority given in the book to political scientists and lawyers, and their analysis is rather in the foreground. But one of the distinctive characteristics of the book is that it's very much a cross-disciplinary book with perspectives from different disciplines. So what we'll have in the next webinars is more of a panel kind of presentation, where we'll be hearing angles that can be brought into the current questions from different academic disciplines. So it'll be different, but I think it will also be very rich. So I know we can depend on the SMP to send in good time announcements of when the next ones are coming up, and I do commend them to you. And with that, I'll hand back to David for the final conclusion.
Thanks ever so much, Ken, and my thanks, of course, to two excellent speakers, Dr. Fidelis Edge Kanyongolo and Dr. Gerhard Anders, both of whom, as Kenneth said, are great friends of the Scotland-Malawi partnership. We're delighted to have Edge in Scotland for, I think it was Edinburgh University Centre for Africa Studies celebration some years back, maybe 8 years or so back. Last time I saw Edge was, I think I was buying him a cheap pizza on the Royal Mile, which probably wasn't the best pizza in Scotland, but it was excellent company, and hence most memorable. Thank you also to Ken. Ken stepped in at the last minute when our usual chair for this series, Asiati Chiweza, one of the other co-editors of the book, wasn't able to make it, and Ken's been balancing other things. So my thanks particularly to Ken as well. As Ken says, I can be a smug one because I've got a copy of this excellent book on my desk here, and as Ken said at the start, it is available in the Africa Books Collective or on Amazon if you're at this side, the Scottish side. It's slightly more expensive, but with Scotland-Malawi partnership sponsorship, it will be the main print run in Malawi later on this year. I appreciate it might be a bit frustrating attending this series and not having the book on your desk. Craig, if you're able to put up the poll just while I'm saying last final remarks, please do give us your feedback there. That'd be really helpful. The next session, as Kenneth said, is a panel discussion, sort of move from 60 to 90 minutes. We won't quite take up Gerhard's proposal of 24 hours, but it'll be an hour and a half at least for the next one. And we have 4 themes that we're covering. That is trust in election management bodies, violence against women in elections, choice of electoral systems, and the 50-50 campaigns, gender equality. Our Scottish respondent is Susan Dalgetty, a well-known and respected Scottish journalist. We're fairly confident the date for that is going to be Tuesday the 29th, starting at 1 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. Malawi time, but we will confirm closer to the time. I suppose the final point I want to make is, as Gerhard said, this session's been a bit unique because both our speakers have been experts on this theme in the Malawian context. So we've been very entirely Malawian focused, but I'm keen. It is a partnership, and integral to any partnership is the spirit of reciprocity. And I think it's appropriate to recognize that, sadly, political violence is not limited to Malawi, but is also seen in UK and Scotland. In fact, one could reasonably speculate that it might be increasing at this side of the partnership, just as it decreases, as we speculated, at the Malawian side. in 2016 with the murder of Joe Cox in the run-up to the referendum, in last year the murder of Sir David Amess, as well as political abuse of. This week we were learning that BBC's outgoing BBC Scotland journalist, last week the leader of the opposition, and last year on Ian Duncan Smith in the Conservative conference. So I'm very keen to recognise in that spirit of reciprocity and in self-awareness and with all humility that many of the themes that we've discussed are also relevant in the Scottish context, and each of our other sessions in this series will draw on Scotland's learning, warts and all, in this space. But my thanks once again to all the speakers. Thanks for attending, and I hope you can join us on the 29th of March. Thank you very much indeed.